The morning I realized something had shifted, I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. My daughter-in-law had rearranged the cabinets again. The mugs I'd had since Gerald passed were pushed to the back, behind a row of matching ones she'd ordered online. White. Minimalist. Nothing like the hand-painted blue one my sister brought me from New Mexico 20 years ago. That one was gone entirely. I didn't say anything. I reheated my coffee, stood at the window, and watched the oak tree in the backyard sway in the October wind. That should have been the moment I paid attention. But I told myself it was just mugs. My name is Eleanor, and I am 69 years old. I lived in the house my husband and I built our life in, just outside of Houston, Texas. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a garden I've kept going for 31 years. Gerald planted the rose bushes along the south fence the spring before he got sick. I've never let them die. When my son came to me 2 years ago and said he and his wife were struggling, I didn't hesitate. That's not who I was. I had raised him to know that family shows up, and so I showed up. I told them they could move in while they got back on their feet. My son worked in logistics. His wife, I'll call her Renee, had recently left a job she said didn't suit her. They had a daughter, my granddaughter Lily, who was 7 years old and had her grandfather's eyes. I thought, 6 months, maybe 8. I thought, this is what you do. That was 22 months ago. In those 22 months, I learned things about myself I hadn't expected to learn at 69. I learned that I had spent so long taking care of others that I had forgotten what it felt like to be taken care of. I had forgotten even what it felt like to simply be considered. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first year was manageable. There were moments of friction. Renee had strong opinions about how the living room should be arranged, and she once threw away a casserole dish I'd had since my wedding, because she said it was taking up space. But I absorbed these things. I told myself that living together is an adjustment. I told myself that patience was a virtue I had in abundance. What I didn't account for was the way small things accumulate. By the second year, my son was paying for streaming services and gym memberships and 2 car payments, and somehow the electric bill was still in my name and still unpaid until I paid it. I had started buying groceries for 4 people on a fixed income. I had started leaving cash on the counter when I noticed Renee eyeing her wallet with a particular kind of frustration, the kind that meant someone else was about to be asked to solve her problem. I told myself this was love. I told myself I was helping, but love doesn't hollow you out. And I was beginning to feel hollow. The night everything changed, truly, irrevocably changed, was a Saturday in late November. My son had gotten a bonus at work. A real one, he said. Enough to celebrate. Renee had decided they would have a special dinner, and she'd spent the afternoon in the kitchen with the door half closed, working on something that smelled like garlic and red wine. I had offered to help twice. Both times, she said she had it under control. I set the table. I put out the good cloth napkins, the ivory ones with the embroidered edges that had been a wedding gift to Gerald and me. I lit the candles. I thought, tonight will be good. Tonight we'll sit together and things will feel like family. When Renee called us to the table, there were 3 plates arranged at the settings I'd laid out. Thick ribeye steaks with roasted potatoes and asparagus. A bottle of wine I didn't recognize, already opened. There was no plate at my seat. I stood at the edge of the dining room and looked at the table. My son was already sitting down. Renee was pouring the wine. Lily glanced up at me with those serious eyes of hers, and then looked back down at her plate. "Oh," Renee said without looking at me. "I made enough for the 3 of us. There's leftover soup in the fridge from Tuesday. Should still be good." She said it the way you might mention the weather. Incidental. Already forgotten. My son picked up his fork. I want to tell you that I said something sharp and clarifying in that moment. I want to tell you that I stood up straight and put words to the thing that was sitting on my chest like a stone. But I didn't. I went to the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator. I found the soup tomato, 4 days old, and I heated it in a pot on the stove while the smell of their steak drifted through the house. I sat at the kitchen counter and ate alone. And something inside me that had been bending for a very long time finally broke. Not dramatically, not with noise. It was more like the quiet snap of a branch that had been weighted down by ice all winter. A clean break. And once it broke, everything became very clear. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my bed in the bedroom that had been mine and Gerald's for 27 years. And I looked at the ceiling and I thought about my life. I thought about the rose bushes along the south fence. I thought about the mug from New Mexico that had disappeared. I thought about 22 months of groceries and electric bills and cash left on the counter. I thought about a plate that wasn't set for me at my own table. I thought about what Gerald would say. Gerald was a quiet man, but he had a way of cutting through noise. He used to say, "Eleanor, you teach people how to treat you." He said it gently, always. Not as a criticism, as a reminder. I had been teaching the wrong lesson for a very long time. By 5 in the morning, I was dressed. Dark slacks, the cream blouse I saved for important occasions. I put on the pearl earrings Gerald gave me for our 25th anniversary. I made a fresh pot of coffee, poured it into a travel mug, not one of Renee's white ones, and I picked up the accordion folder I had quietly assembled over the previous 3 weeks. Because here is what I have not yet told you. I had sensed this coming, not the dinner specifically, but the direction of things. And I had been preparing. In that folder were the account statements my financial advisor Margaret had helped me organize. Margaret had been managing a portion of my retirement savings for 11 years. She was 71, sharp as a tack, and she had a way of saying difficult things with such plainness that they didn't feel like an attack. They just felt like facts. When I had called her 2 weeks earlier and started explaining the situation, she had listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Eleanor, I've been waiting for you to call me." We had met twice since then. Quietly. I had told no one. That Sunday morning I drove to the 24-hour diner on Route 9 and I sat in a corner booth and I spread Margaret's documents across the table. The waitress, a young woman named Deb, who wore her hair in 2 braids, brought me coffee and a piece of pecan pie. I hadn't ordered but accepted gratefully. She didn't ask questions. I appreciated that. I went through everything carefully. The joint account I had added my son to 3 years ago as a convenience that would need to change. The credit card I had co-signed for him when his own application was denied. I could not remove myself from the debt, but I could stop being the one who covered the minimum payments when he didn't. The utilities, still in my name. The phone plan I had added them to because it was cheaper as a family plan. One by one, I made a list. At 8 o'clock, I drove to Margaret's office. She was already there. She had a pot of Earl Grey on and a yellow legal pad with notes from our last conversation. She looked at me when I walked in at the pearl earrings and the accordion folder, and she nodded once. The way people nod when they understand that something important has been decided. "You ready?" she said. "I've been ready," I said. "I just needed to get here." We spent 3 hours going through it. Margaret was methodical and kind, and she didn't let me second-guess myself when I started to waver. There was one moment, about an hour in, when I said, "But he's my son," and she looked at me over her reading glasses and she said, "And you're his mother." Those 2 things are both true. Now let's keep going. So we kept going. I want to tell you about Lily. My granddaughter is 9 years old. She is quiet like her grandfather was, and observant in the way that quiet children often are. She notices things. She had noticed, I think, more than anyone gave her credit for. The Monday after the dinner, I came home from an errand to find Lily sitting on the porch steps. It was 4 in the afternoon, and cold enough for a jacket, which she wasn't wearing. She was holding a leaf she'd picked up from the yard, turning it over in her hands. I sat down beside her. I didn't ask what was wrong. I just sat. After a while, she said, "Grandma, do you know where your blue mug went?" I looked at her. "I've been wondering that myself," I said. She was quiet again. Then, "Mom put it in the donate box in the garage." I saw her. I didn't say anything because I didn't know if I was supposed to. She looked at the leaf. "I should have said something." "You were being careful," I said. "That's okay. But you like that mug." She said it simply, not as an accusation, just as a statement of fact, the kind children make before they learn to soften things. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, and we sat there on the porch in the October cold until the light started changing. I said, "Lily, I want you to know something. You can always say something. When you see something that isn't right, you are allowed to say so. Okay?" She nodded. She kept looking at the leaf. After a moment, she said, "Are you going to be okay, Grandma?" And I thought about the accordion folder in my car. I thought about Margaret's yellow legal pad. I thought about Gerald's rose bushes and the mug from New Mexico and 22 months of making myself smaller to fit around other people's comfort. "Yes," I said, "I really am." What happened next did not happen all at once. That is important to understand. The changes I made were not a single dramatic gesture. They were a series of careful, deliberate decisions made over 3 weeks, each one thought through, each one irreversible by design. The joint account was separated first. My bank manager was a patient woman who asked no unnecessary questions and processed the paperwork efficiently. I opened a new account in my name only and transferred what needed to be transferred. The account my son had access to remained open, with a balance of $100, enough for him to see the statement, enough for him to understand. The credit card was more complicated, but Margaret had helped me draft a letter to my son explaining that as of the 1st of the following month, I would no longer be covering any portion of the balance or the minimum payment. The letter was factual. It did not contain accusations. It simply stated what was changing and when. The phone plan was easier than I expected. The utilities I dealt with last. I contacted the providers and arranged to have the accounts transferred to my son's name. This required his participation, and I knew that meant a conversation I had been putting off. I also called a realtor, not to sell the house immediately, but to understand what it was worth and what my options were. I had been thinking quietly about a smaller place, maybe something closer to my sister in Santa Fe, maybe something that was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. The realtor came on a Wednesday morning while Renee was out. His name was David, and he walked through my house with a careful eye and told me, in plain numbers, what 31 years of tending a home was worth. I walked him through the garden. I showed him the rose bushes along the south fence, blooming improbably late into the season. "These are beautiful," he said. "My husband planted them," I said. "I'll be taking cuttings when I go." The conversation with my son happened on a Thursday evening. I asked him to sit with me on the porch after dinner. Renee was inside. Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table. I had thought a great deal about how to begin. I had written notes, crossed them out, started over. In the end, I put the notes away. I sat across from him in the porch chairs we'd had since he was a boy, and I said, "I need to tell you some things, and I need you to listen." He listened. I told him about the account. I told him about the credit card letter, which I handed to him in an envelope. I told him about the utilities and what would need to happen for the transfer. I told him that I was speaking with a realtor, and that while nothing was decided yet, I was considering my options. And then I told him about the dinner. Not with anger, I had moved past anger by then. I told him the way you tell someone a true thing, plainly, without decoration. I said, I sat in the kitchen and ate cold soup alone while the three of you had dinner 4 feet away. And I said, I am your mother, and I raised you to know better than that. He didn't defend it. That surprised me. He sat very still, and he looked at his hands, and after a long time he said, I know, Mom, I know. He said, I've been letting things happen that I should have stopped. I've been telling myself it was fine because it was easier than having a hard conversation. He exhaled. That's not an excuse. No, I agreed. It isn't. We sat quietly for a moment. The neighborhood was settling into evening. A dog barked somewhere. A car passed on the street. The rose bushes rustled faintly in the breeze. He said, What do you need from me? I thought about that. What did I need? I needed to know that the woman who had raised this man, who had worked and saved and stayed and tended and shown up, still mattered. Not as a resource. As a person. I said, I need you to act like my son. Not my tenant. Not my bank. My son? He nodded slowly. His eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it. That mattered to me. What I did not tell him that evening, what he would find out later, was what Margaret and I had done with the will. I had updated it quietly 2 weeks earlier, after one of our morning meetings. The house, the savings, the investments I had built over decades, all of it had been redistributed. A portion to my son, yes, a portion set aside in a trust for Lily directly, so that it would reach her regardless of anything else. A portion to the community garden program at the church I'd attended for 20 years. I didn't tell him this to punish him. I told you already I had moved past anger. I did it because it was the right shape for what I actually wanted my life to mean, and because Lily deserved to know, when she was old enough to understand, that her grandmother had thought of her, specifically, by name. Renee and I did not have the same conversation my son and I had. I will not pretend that we reached some neat understanding. She is a complicated person, and my feelings about her are complicated, and I think sometimes life does not resolve the way we want it to. What happened was quieter than a confrontation and more durable than a truce. She understood, from my son and from the changed circumstances, that things were different. She said very little to me directly. What she did do, 2 weeks later, was leave my sister's mug, the Blunkella from New Mexico, on the kitchen counter, retrieved from wherever it had gone. No note, no explanation. I held it in both hands for a moment, before I put it in the cabinet. I chose to count it. The house went on the market in January. I stayed through February while the sale processed, and I spent those weeks doing the things I had neglected, sorting through Gerald's books, going through boxes in the attic I hadn't opened since before he passed, taking cuttings from the rose bushes along the south fence and potting them carefully in containers I could take with me. Lily helped me with the roses. She had decided this was her job, and she approached it with great seriousness, wearing a pair of gardening gloves, 2 sizes too big, carrying the small pot from spot to spot as I worked. She asked me questions the whole time about how roots work, about whether the rose would remember it had come from Texas when it was living somewhere else, about what my sister's house looked like. I answered every question. I liked her questions. They were the right kind. On the last morning, I made coffee in my kitchen for the last time. I stood at the window above the sink and looked out at the yard, the oak tree, the south fence, the garden I had kept for 31 years. I thought about Gerald. I thought about all the mornings I had stood in exactly this spot, watching the light change over that yard, and I was surprised to find that what I felt was not grief, not primarily. Underneath the grief, holding it up, was something sturdier. Gratitude, maybe. Or maybe just the particular peace of a woman who has finally decided what she is worth. I drove out of Houston on a Tuesday morning with my car packed and 2 potted rose cuttings secured on the back seat. The road opened up west of the city, and the sky got wide the way Texas skies do. That particular blue that seems to go on longer than sky has any right to go. I called my sister from the road. She said, "How are you feeling?" I thought about it honestly, the way she always expected me to. "Like myself," I said. "Finally, like myself." She laughed. I heard her put the kettle on in the background. "There is something I want to say, and I want to say it plainly, because I think it is the truest thing I have learned, and it is the thing I most wish someone had said to me years earlier. You are not selfish for having limits. You are not cold for enforcing them. You are not failing at love when you stop letting love be used as a reason to diminish yourself. I was a good mother. I was a good wife. I was generous with what I had: my time, my home, my money, my patience. None of that becomes untrue because I eventually said, enough. Generosity is not the same as disappearing. And a woman who has worked and built and endured and loved for 69 years is not required to make herself small so that other people can feel comfortable taking up more space. I know that now. I know it the way you know things that have cost you something to learn. My sister's house in Santa Fe is smaller than the one I left. It has a courtyard in the back with a clay pot, where I've replanted one of the rose cuttings. It sits in the afternoon sun and is doing better than I expected. The other cutting is in a pot by my bedroom window. Lily calls me every Sunday. Her mother doesn't know she does, or maybe she does and has decided not to make it an issue. Either way, Lily calls. She tells me about school, about a book she's reading, about a girl in her class who she thinks might become a real friend. I tell her about Santa Fe. I tell her about the roses. Last week she asked me if the rose remembered Texas yet. I told her. I thought it was still deciding. I still have the blue mug. It sits in my cabinet here in Santa Fe alongside 2 others I brought with me. I use it on Sunday mornings when the light is good and the courtyard is quiet. I hold it in both hands and drink my coffee slowly. And I look at the rose by the window, and I think about what it means to tend something through the winter and still see it bloom. It means you didn't give up on it. It means you believed it was worth the effort. I am worth the effort. I think I always was.